So last week, Jono brought us a word, and at the end he said that God was challenging us to be a blessing and bring a blessing and to share Jesus. And so I'm hoping that today what I'm going to bring will help to unpack an aspect of that for us. I had prepared what I was going to bring a couple of weeks ago, but it felt really even more right to bring it after I heard Jono speak last week. So I hope that that's going to be a blessing. To start with, it's not going to be a normal sermon. It's going to be something a bit different to how we usually preach, because I'm not going to be particularly focusing in on one passage. I'm actually going to be focusing on a story, and in fact a whole book of the Bible. And because we want to get home by lunchtime, I'm not going to read the whole book of the Bible, but I'm going to tell you the story, and we're going to jump in and out of it. And so the story starts after the Babylonian exile, many years after that, and King Darius and the kings of Persia have prior to that have conquered the land, including the land of Israel. And so we're in the Medo-Persian Empire, which is basically the if you remember the statue in Daniel, it's the silver part of that. So that there was a gold head, which was the empire of Babylon, and then there was the prediction that another empire would take over, and that would be the silver part of the statue. And so this is the Medo-Persian Empire, and it's actually this story. It's really quite odd, but this story kind of sits in a time where the king at the time, King Xerxes, was in battle with Greece, who will be the next part of that statue, the next empire to take over the provinces, and he's in an unsettled place where he's actually coming to the last years really of the empire, of the Persian Empire, and he's sort of locked in battle with Greece. And so as we read this story over the years, it seems like the story is being told over quite a short period of time, but actually it's being told over a few years. And during those years, there's in the background, there's all these battles going on, and Xerxes is actually sort of invading Athens and things like that, and getting beaten, and then being slaughtered, and then coming back to Susa, which is where he sits on the throne. And there's this strange story kind of in the middle of all of this. So Xerxes is the king, and he's also his other name is Ahasuerus, which I can't say, and so I'm going to call him Xerxes. so he's got two names, and so now this is an arrogant king. He's a lazy king. He's influenced really easily. He gets drunk a lot, and he makes really silly decisions. He's got really poor judgment, and he's heading to defeat on the battlefield of Greece. And he sits on the throne at a place called Susa, which is the seat of the throne of the empire of Persia Media, which covers 127 provinces. It's a really large area. He's a silly man with an awful lot of power, really. And so he decides, in amongst all of this feast, and he decides that he's going to hold a festival, a feast, and this feast is going to go on for about 6 months, and during this feast, he's going to bring all of the governors and the princes of all the provinces, and he's basically going to show off. And he's basically going to show his glory in his kingdom, and which just feels really, it's a bit like peacocking as you're about to go into battle. And so the strange thing about the book, so this is the book of Esther, is that it's 9 chapters, and it's like a page turner of a book. So I hope if nothing else, I inspire you to go and read it, because it's a great story to read. The strange thing about the book of Esther is that at no point in the book of Esther is God mentioned. No one talks about God. His name doesn't come up. And so why is this book in the Bible? So why has God got a book in the Bible that doesn't even talk about him? Well, I think that's firstly, I think it reflects the times. This is my opinion, by the way. I think that at the time when the Jews were exiled, many of them remained, even though the Persian Empire gave them Jerusalem back to go and rebuild, many of the communities of the Jews actually stayed in where they'd been exiled to, and started to assimilate with the local traditions and cultures. And what I mean by that is they started to dilute their own Jewish laws and take on the society and the cultures and the social aspects of where they were living. And so I think the book reflects that. I think this book reflects that kind of dilution of God from these communities. And so and secondly, I think God wants this book in the Bible because I think that there are moments in here that could be really overlooked, undervalued, and taken as chance and coincidence, where actually we see God's hand at work behind the scenes for his greater plans. And, God is a God who loves his people. His main aim really is he wants to be in relationship with you and me. And throughout history, he has been planning and has planned and put forward and executed his plan in our lives so that he can have a relationship with you and to be close with you. And so this book demonstrates God's providence, which is his care and protection and his future provision for his people and for their salvation. So I think it is a really important book of the Bible, and it gives us a really clear message that I will conclude at the end. But for now, I'm going to tell you the story. So what I would like you to do, I'm going to challenge you to do this. There's no right answer to this, because I think there's even things going on in this book that none of us will recognise as being God's hand. But I want you, if you're writing anything down or just on your hand, I want you to see if you can count how many times you notice a really strong coincidence or something that's happened that seems that well, that's a bit lucky, or that's a bit of a coincidence in this story. And so King Xerxes commissions this feast. It's going to be and first of all, there's one for all the provinces to visit, all the leaders and the princes, and they all come on, and the purpose is for them to see how glorious and wonderful their king is, and how strong and rich he is. And that goes on for 180 days, and then at the end of that, he has a 7-day feast where he which is just it's a bit like a party where all the people from out of town disappear off home, and you're left with just the family and the close friends who are sleeping overnight, and you're all going to continue having continue into the night having the party. And so he has another 7-day feast where he brings out the gold and the silver and the furnishings of purple, which are all kingly colours, and he brings out the best wine, and everyone's drinking in goblets and gets all the best crockery out, and the gold and the silver, and everybody is is drinking, and he brings out a special edict, which is like a law. And the laws in the Persian Empire, they would be scribed and then sealed with the king's seal. And once that was sealed with the king's seal, it couldn't be overturned even by the king. And so he would bring out this law that meant that during this feast, people could break tradition. And the tradition of the day was to if you were eating and drinking with the king, when the king drank, you would drink, and when the king ate, you would eat, and when the king stopped, you would stop, and so on. But he was saying to everybody, basically, no rules, no boundaries, drink what you like, get as drunk as you like, and you can do whatever you like at this party, and anything goes. And so he allowed people to break tradition for this party. And it says in one of the verses, the king was full of wine, which is a fancy way of saying the king got very drunk. And so whilst he was drunk, this king seems to make all of his worst decisions when he's had a bit too much to drink, or if he's listening to the wrong people. And he said, there must have been some conversation about who's the most beautiful woman in the province, because the king decides that he wants to get his queen, who's Queen Vashti at the time, to come out with her crown and parade around in front of all of these drunken men, because all the women are having a different party somewhere else. And so Queen Vashti is put into a bit of a moral dilemma, because actually in that time, women wore veils, and it would have been a real social no-no for a woman to walk around parading her beauty and wearing her crown with a veil off. And so she's put into a situation where she has to choose between her integrity and obeying her husband. And so she says no, she's got some integrity, and so then there's this discussion against the men. Oh my goodness, what will happen if all of our wives start disobeying us? What will happen if they all follow the queen, and then all of our wives start disobeying us? So the king gets his signet ring out again, and in law they decide that they're going to set a law that that all the wives must obey their husbands. And in this law, in this edict as well, the king decides that Vashti must be banished from his sight, and so she's banished from his palaces, and possibly the province, it doesn't say, but she's banished from the king's sight. Basically, she's not his queen anymore. And so, I mean, this king would put like a weekly donut day in law if somebody told him to. That's how weak he is. He just has these conversations and starts making laws all over the place. And so then what happens is that there is some time lapse now, which doesn't look like time lapse, but between chapter 1 and 2 there's some time lapse. And in that time, there's some battles going on, and which some of that information isn't in the Bible. It's other historical records, and so the king has sobered up at some point, and he realizes he doesn't have a queen, sorry, and so his attendants have a suggestion. And their suggestion is, you couldn't write this honestly. Their suggestion is, why don't we just gather all the beautiful women in the provinces, all of the young virgins, and we'll bring them all into the palace. We'll create a harem of all the beautiful women, and we'll have a beauty pageant. We'll parade all of these women in front of the king, and he can choose his new queen. And so. So that's so the king goes, oh yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, let's do that then. And so off they go, and they gather all of these beautiful women and create a harem. And they put all of these women under the care of Haggai, who is one of the king's eunuchs, one of his servants, to take care of them. And the idea is that for 12 months, they're basically going to be having beauty spas for 12 months, have all the most expensive products and ointments, and be beautified for 12 months before and prepared for being put in front of the queen, in front of the king. And so the king is going to choose his queen, and he agrees, and the women are gathered. And so that's where we see our first passage, which Tony's going to come and read for us, which is where we meet Mordecai and Esther. And Mordecai and Esther are descended from the Jewish exiles. And so Tony's going to introduce us to them.
So this is Esther 2, verses 5 to 18. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with the Jeconian king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Hegai, Esther was also taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Hegai, who had charge of the women. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor. And he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. Now, when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments for women. When the young women went into the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she would go in, and in the morning, she would return to the second harem in custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with all generosity.
Thank you. Can you tell that with you? Okay, and so Mordecai is of Jewish descent. He remains in his home in Jerusalem. Oh, sorry, double mic'd. Remained in his home in Jerusalem, and it's easy to put him on a pedestal during this story, because there's lots of really great attributes to Mordecai, but just remembering that the Jewish nation are living in a culture that is really against a lot of the rules of the laws of God, and we see it's just an example, really. We see Esther being made to parade her beauty in front of a king who's a Gentile and is going to be, potentially marrying a Gentile. And this doesn't feel like something that would be a godly act, really. And although it seems that this is something that she can't get away from, we can really see the tension of living in that ungodly society. And so Mordecai adopts Esther. She's lost her parents. And he stays close to her throughout this. He walks around outside the palace, looking out for her, making sure she's okay. And he gives her wise counsel. And so, in many ways, Mordecai just blesses Esther every day. He is a huge support, safety for her. And Esther is a beautiful woman. She loves her uncle. She trusts him. She takes wise counsel from him, and she's obedient towards him, as we see through the story. And these two are in the lowest part of society. She's an orphan, firstly, and they're part of the Jewish community who were considered the lowest part of society in the regions. And so something about her character and her beauty means that everyone around her shows her favor. Now, it's not clear exactly what that is, but everybody around her, Haggai, who's looking after her, the king, and all of her maidservants all show her favor. And Haggai helps to prepare her for the king. But Mordecai advises Esther not to let him know that she's Jewish, and so she's obedient to him and takes his wise counsel. So the beauty pageant goes ahead, and it's Esther's turn to go in front of the king, and he basically falls in love with her, this orphan girl from the lowest part of society. What luck. And then whilst this is all going on, in the background, just outside the city walls, Mordecai is hanging around by the city gates, and he overhears, luckily he overhears two servants of the king who are plotting against the king to kill him. And so Mordecai has the very good fortune to have the ear of the queen of Persia, and so he tells Esther, and Esther tells the king, and the plot's investigated. The men are caught, and Mordecai's name then goes in the records, the chronicles, the king's big book of all of his reign and all the good things he's done and all the things that happened to him. And we just bear that in mind, because that comes up again later. So Mordecai is now immortalized in the king's book of all of his kingdom and all of his reign. And then enter the baddie of the story. This is Haman, and Haman is an interesting character, because actually he's descended from the Amalekites, and the Amalekites, if you read further back in the Bible, we're not going to do that today. If we could be here for hours, but if we read further back in the Bible, the Amalekites are historic enemies of the Jews, and the Jews have been victorious over them in the past. And so now we have this representation of the Amalekites and the Jews again in this sort of microcosm, in this place. We have that metaphor really of the struggle between God's enemies and his people. And so Haman is promoted to be second to the king. So he's on his right hand side. And the king really trusts Haman too much. And I think the king's really got insecurity problems, because he seems to just listen to everybody else and not himself most of the time. And so Haman, he's called Haman the Agagite, which is he's descended from the royalty, the Amalekite royalty. And so he comes into the picture, and so now there's an ancient enemy of the Jews in position of power. And the king has everyone bowing down to Haman. So when you meet him in the street, you're supposed to bow down to him. And now Mordecai, in his Jewish tradition, would not be worshipping a man in the way that the king is asking them to worship Haman. And so it doesn't say this, but I'm making a bit of an assumption. But Mordecai decides that he's going to refuse to bow down in front of Haman, and Haman gets really angry with him, and he plots to kill him. But he doesn't just plot to kill Mordecai. He decides he's going to kill the whole Jewish nation who's living in the 127 provinces of Persia. And so he decides that he's going to deceive the king. And so Jerry is going to be Haman for a moment. Just remember to forget that once he's left, because he's a really nice man. But he's going to be a Haman for the moment. And this is what Haman says to the king.
There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it's not to be to the king's profit to tolerate them. If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasuries.
So Haman kind of deceives the king. He doesn't mention the Jews. He just says there are certain people, and so he plots to. And the king, obviously, we know king's a bit wishy-washy and listens to everybody, and so he just gives Haman his ring and says, "Here's my signet ring. Do whatever you feels fit." He puts complete trust in him, and so an edict is written and sealed by the signet ring of the king that the Jewish nation is going to be killed, and Haman then goes and throws lots, which is dice, and to decide the day and the time when that's going to happen. And so there's a day and a time when it's going to happen. Now So the king and Haman are celebrating. They think this is great. They think they've done something really good. But this word gets out into Susa, which is a city in the city, and so suddenly there's confusion, because suddenly where the Jews and the Persians have lived, they're neighbours. They've lived together. They've managed to work to assimilate into their surroundings, and there's a modicum of peace, really. I'm sure that there's some persecution and some difficulty, but mostly there seems to be a working relationship. And suddenly the neighbours of the Jews are being told that on a certain day, a certain time, you're going to have to kill your neighbour. And so the Jews in the city begin to mourn and tear their clothes and go into and Mordecai puts on sackcloth and ashes and mourns by the citadel gate, because suddenly the whole nation of the whole Jewish nation are in danger. Now Esther doesn't really know what's going on outside, and so she all she hears is that Mordecai is mourning, and so she sends someone with him some clothes for him, because if you're in mourning clothes, you're not allowed to enter into the palace or into the citadel. So she sends some clothes out to Mordecai to say, "Put some clothes on so I can see you. I miss you." And of course Mordecai sends a message back saying no, and so she sends a messenger out to find out what's gone on, and Mordecai tells Esther what's happened, and obviously she weeps and mourns for her nation as well. And so Mordecai and Esther are luckily in a really great situation, because the Queen of Persia has the ear of the king, and so you know, this is really great. So Mordecai says to Esther, you must go to the king and plead for the Jews. And Esther sends a note back to him saying, I can't, because anyone who goes to the king without being called upon or invited is put to death unless he hands out his golden scepter to invite you to come in. And she said it's dangerous for me. What if he doesn't? What if he's having a bad day or he's drunk or something? And I go and then he puts me to death. And Mordecai says something really important here, and he says to her basically that God will. The Jewish nation, he doesn't use the word God, but he said the Jewish nation will always be saved, and it will be done in some way. So you you can either choose to do this and take the risk, or you can stay in the king's palace and fall with the king when the Jewish nation are saved. And so there's some trust in God that whatever happens, he will save his nation, save his people. And so then the king's so Esther goes ahead and she decides, she says, right, go fast for 3 days, and in 3 days I'll come before the king. And so she comes before the king, and and the king holds out his scepter and says, come in and talk to me. And he says, what do you want? And she says, I would like to hold a banquet for you. I'd like you and Haman to come, and I'm going to serve you. And so Esther chooses to serve her king. And then so that's all great. And then so they come and they're all very pleased. And at the banquet, the king says, what do you want, Esther? Why have you come to me? And she says, I want to throw you another banquet. And so there's a second banquet. And so I feel like she's kind of trying to buttering up with food and what the best way to a man's heart. And so she offers another banquet. But and so Haman says, Haman's going, great, you know, the queen loves me. She wants to cook for me again, or she wants to provide this banquet for me again. I'm really in there with the king and queen because they've invited me into their personal chamber to have this. He's on high because he thinks he's like the only person in the provinces that's got this honor. And so, but he says, he goes home to his friends and family and says, I'm so honored by this, but it doesn't mean anything because Mordecai is still alive. And so his wife decides to suggest to him that he builds a gallows, a big spike out in the town to kill Mordecai on. And so the plan is that Haman's going to go back the next day to the king and petition to have Mordecai killed. But that night, by coincidence, the king can't sleep. Something keeps him awake. I don't know what. And he asks for his chronicles to be brought to him, to read to him, a bit like when a child needs a story read to them to go to sleep, I think. And by every luck in the world, the particular part of his book, of his reign, that's read to him is the part where Mordecai saves him from the plot to kill him. And so the king says to his servants, was this man ever honored? And of course, Mordecai wasn't honored at the time. And so the king decides to have him honored. And the ironic thing is that Haman is the person in the court at the time. He calls for whoever's in the court and he says to Haman, you know, what should the man that I want to honor have done for him? And Haman's like, oh yeah, this is me. I must be the man because I'm the top dog at the moment. And so he says, oh, he should have the best horse. He should be paraded through the town. He should have royal robes put on him. And he goes on and on. It's like, wow, this is going to be great. So he feels like he's creating his own honor. And then the king says, oh, great, that's a good idea. Mordecai is the person I want to honor. And so Haman has to be the one to go and parade Mordecai through the town with the king's robes on him and be honoured. And so just the irony of that, just that that kind of small, if we look back at what I said earlier about this sort of representation of God's enemies and Mordecai the Jew, and just in that moment there's a demonstration of God's victory over his enemies as Haman parades and honours Mordecai the Jew around the town. And so the feast happens the next day, and the king asks Esther again, what is it that you want? And she said, and she pleads with the king for her people to be saved. And so the king does for her what he did for Haman. He hands her his signet ring and says, do what you want. And so her and Mordecai scribe and seal with the king's signet ring that the Jews are able to defend themselves against their enemies. And so then what happens is, when the day comes for the Jews to be killed, they pick up their arms and they defend themselves. And by pure coincidence, they managed to overturn all, by pure luck and providence. They managed to overturn their enemies, and they're victorious. And there's a great fear that falls upon all of the Jews' enemies at that time, which leads to them being victorious. The people around them who are trying to kill them are literally scared, frozen. And so what happens at the end of this story is a feast of Purim is instructed, which is a yearly festival to remember the day that the Jewish nation in Persia was saved. And so and Mordecai was honoured and promoted, and so now there's a Jew who stands next to the king in the empire of Persia. So I wonder how many times you saw God's hand at work in that story. I'm not going to ask you for examples because there were many, but I wonder how many times you saw God's hand at work in that story. I wonder how many times there were coincidences and things that could be overlooked or undervalued that happened. And I wonder if this story can inspire us to look for God in our daily lives, because we see God at work in obvious things like answer to prayer and in miracles or in healing. But I think more often God's hand is in our life and seen in the everyday things that we might overlook or not notice. And I think that God's presence is with us all the time in our normality, even in the times when we're making a bit of a mess of things. Mordecai and Esther lived in a time where many Jews had assimilated with their surroundings, and yet God was still working regardless of that for his purposes and for their good. And so this story is about trusting in God's providence, even where we don't notice him there, and looking for those moments that we might undervalue. And the second point that I really want to make, which has been really on my heart recently before we end, is that God delights in us when we bless one another. Mordecai was a blessing to Esther. He shared his wisdom, he encouraged her, he made her feel safe, he gave her confidence. Esther was humble, she was obedient, she listened to wise counsel. She wasn't greedy, she served the king. God used all of these things in his plan to save the Jews. He didn't need to. God doesn't need anybody to help him save us. But God delights in working with us and working with what we bring to him. He delights in his relationship with us. We may sometimes feel disheartened that efforts that we put in seem to be a waste of time. We may feel like our wise choices, our acts of kindness, our encouragements to people, our prayers seem insignificant and worthless. But each time we bring a blessing, or we are a blessing, or we share Jesus, God delights in us. No blessing we bring is wasted or worthless. In his eyes, he uses each and everything we bring to share in us, with us, in his purposes. And I'm just going to remind you of that quote from the Lord of Rings that John O brought last week. It's time for us to decide what we do with the time given to us. And I think in that, it's time for us to recognize our value and the value of every small thing we do, and how in God's eyes it's valuable, it's worth it, and it brings great value to his kingdom, even when we may feel like it's insignificant. Every time you say hello to someone in the street and you smile at them, we bless them. And that's not wasted in God's eyes. He delights in that. And I could keep going, I'm going to stop now. But